Hello Exiles and welcome to my Thor build guide video. Do you wanna feel like Thor? Build the Mjölner and destroy your foes with lightning? Well, this build is just for you. I first played this build in Calandra in hardcore, where minus lightning resistance was very easy to get for Dorian's prototype, and enjoyed it so much that I thought I would share it. I made a build guide post on the Path of Exile forums back in Calandra League, but it is obviously out of date now, so I renewed it and made a new guide post, and this is the video guide. Build explanation. This build is a very unique heavy and not really recommended for solo self-found players, unless they have most key uniques so build can at least function. The most important unique is obviously Mjölner. Other important uniques are Dorianis prototype, Ascendancy, Alpha's Howl, Glorious Vanity, and Melding of the Flesh. The uniques we will eventually want are 2 Ventor's Gambles, Energized Armor, and the very expensive The Squire. Yeah, I was not kidding when I said this build was unique heavy. Mjölner lets us trigger our arc on hit with 0.25 second cooldown. Most people that use Mjölner use it with Cyclone, but there's one more thematically fitting option, and that is Static Strike. Now, normal Static Strike works just fine, but to reach the speed of Mjölner, we use Phantasmal Static Strike, which gives 1% increased beam frequency per 1% quality. We use Dorianis prototype for the nearby enemies have lightning resistance equal to yours effects, for which we use some other items which we will get into in a bit. Ascendancy for reaching high attribute requirements of Mjölner, Alpha's Howl to fit all our auras into our build, which also grants freeze immunity and a bit of cold resistance. Glorious Vanity with In the Name of Shibakuwa to make up for the loss of survivability that comes with using Dorian's prototype, especially against lightning damage over time. We use Melding of the Flesh and Ventor's Gamble rings to drop our lightning resistance as much as we can. Though these items are hard to get with good rolls, we work our way to it one item at a time. Energized Armor, socketed at the jewel spot left of the Templar starting point, gives great amounts of armor with our passive tree setup. Eventually, when we have enough currency to make the build reach its true power, we get the Squire Shield, which lets us support our arc skill, socketed in Mjölner, with 3 more support gems, almost doubling our damage. After those, if we still have more currency to invest in the build, we can get a pricey Watcher's Eye with Wrath and Zealotry affixes. With Static Strike, we use sports that help arc and ease gameplay rather than scale its damage, as we do not use it as our main damage skill. We will look at this more in gem setup section. We use Shield Charge to move around quickly, Ancestral Cry to activate Static Strike more conveniently, and Flame Dash as our blink skill. Also Molten Shell linked with cast when damage taken for extra survivability. We use many auras to strengthen our build. Tempest Shield for spell block as well as shock immunity. Determination for armor, which is vital for our survivability in this build, as well as Grace paired with Iron Reflexes Keystone for even more armor. Wrath for great amounts of damage, and Zealotry for more damage and convenient consecrated ground creation. Enchantments also play a role in this build, especially the Boot Enchant. That states adds 1 to 160 lightning damage if you haven't killed recently. Even though not too great of an increase, it will still help us when bossing. This build has couple weak points though. One, and the greatest one, is lightning damage over time. While mapping, we need to be very careful when we encounter one. Even though it is not an instant death, it still hurts a lot. On bossing, Baron influenced maps and the boss itself casts a lightning damage over time area of effect we need to be careful about. Another weak point is Ignite. This build's only mitigation against Ignite comes from the flask affix. Not too much of a weak point, but a weak point nonetheless. Otherwise, we are freeze immune, shock immune, and stun immune, with great amounts of armor and resistances, making this build very tanky against many aspects of the game. Later on, we can get chill immune as well with a boot craft. Pros and cons. Pros: amazing clear, great bossing, tanky, constant damage. Even though our damage numbers may seem low, they are constantly hitting enemies. If you can figure out the gameplay and keep your static strike up at all times, especially when bossing, your damage will be constant without any downtime compared to other hard hitting skills. Even though you're moving around and dodging boss attacks, you will still be hitting the boss. Constant static sound. Cons: have to renew static strike effect every 4 to 5 seconds. This can get a bit annoying at first, but you'll get used to it in no time. Sometimes the attack speed is not enough when hitting moving monsters and misses, making player hit more times to get the static strike effect. This especially happens when there are 1 or 2 monsters on the screen. On packs, Ancestral Cry carries us. This doesn't occur all the time, but when it occurs, it's quite annoying. It's a minor annoyance, but still annoying. Dots are bad. Not viable in SSF. As I mentioned before, uniques are key parts of this build. Getting most of the uniques in this build is a pain in solo self-found. Constant static sound. For Ascendancy, with our first Ascendancy point, if you are in hardcore, I recommend going Sanctuary, as Consecrated Ground helps survivability a lot, as well as it increases enemies' damage taken. After that, I recommend getting Augury of Penitence for more damage. For our third lab, we will get Righteous Providence to get those stats to wield our Mjölner and make itemization easier. For our last Ascendancy point, we will get Pious Path to make effects of Consecrating Ground linger for 4 seconds. For Pantheon, obviously, we try to fix our damage over time weakness. As little as it is, Soul of Aracali and 1 less damage over time is bleeding. We try to fix our damage over time again here, as little as it is, Soul of Relakesh. Apart from the regular stay away map modes such as Reflect or lowered defenses, reduced aura effect, lowered block, armor, max res, etc., we must be careful for these mods. Reduced cooldown recovery. This mod will reduce your DPS as it makes your arc trigger less often. Monsters suppress spell damage. Obviously gonna reduce our damage as we deal damage with arc, which is a spell. Monsters damage ignite. This build lacks defense against ignite and only uses a flash to get rid of it. Be careful when running this mod. Damage as lightning. Obviously, again, be careful when running this mod if you have low armor, etc. There are also some mods we can ignore. Enemy elemental resistance. We don't care about this mod as we set lightning resistance of enemies nearby to our own. Enemies are hexproof. We do not use any curses. For tips, be very careful when mapping. Mana siphoners are obvious and easy to take care of, but in dense maps or laggy PCs, it may be too late when you notice one. You can run Righteous Fire to boost your damage significantly, but lose much on recovery. So if you play on hardcore, I don't recommend Righteous Fire, as our damage is more than enough. Until you get the Squire, play with Rise of the Phoenix to get life regen, some ignite immunity, and being able to run Righteous Fire to some degree. For leveling, I leveled my character using Tabula Rasa and 6 link smite setup. If you don't have access to Tabula Rasa, using smite with any amount of links is fine. It is very fun to level with, linked with ancestral gold. Until you get 90% corruption on your alpha soul, you can use Purity of Fire plus Righteous Fire to get some damage. After you get it though, I recommend switching to Grace as it gives a huge boost to armor. For bandits, we kill all. For Path of Building, I included 2 passive tree segments, one for mid-game and one for endgame. Mid-game bases off of level 70, right about when you equip your Mjölner and Dorianis prototype. And the endgame one is just how to finish the build off at level 100. I didn't include a early game passive tree because the build starts when you wield your Mjölner basically, and before that, however you want to level your character, you are free. I recommend leveling with Smite as it is a very satisfying skill to level with and it carries you until the end of the campaign. In the mid game, to fix our attribute needs, we can get the 30 dexterity or intelligence notes. Feel free to get them until you fix your attributes through items. After this point, when we work our way towards level 100, I recommend getting your hands on a melding of the flesh if you have fixed your resistances. If not, you can delay it until you fix your resistances. Then I recommend going for the energized armor jewel to fix our survivability a lot. You can see how much effective hit pool it gives, how much physical max hit, how much lightning max hit it gives. This is a very vital part for our build to survive. After that, I recommend making our way towards the reservation cluster here. Then once you accumulated enough currency, I recommend going for the cluster jewel setup here to fit all our auras in the build. The small clusters, one is for zealotry reservation and the other is for wrath reservation. The large cluster is just a lightning damage cluster. If you can get a 3 passive one, great, but early on currency is hard. Try to get at least an 8 passive cluster to have enough passive points to allocate the reservation clusters. I don't recommend going for the endgame without a glorious vanity jewel because this keystone right here is very vital for our survivability, especially in hardcore. If you go to endgame without this jewel, you'll probably end up getting your character killed. In softcore you can move on without this, but you will die a lot unless you are really careful. In mid game, if it is hard to find a 2 passive chaos cluster. You can go for a 3 passive chaos cluster, but in endgame we can save 1 passive by fixing our chaos resistance through items. For mid-game gems, we socket our arc in Mjölner, supported with added lightning damage and control destruction. As we do not deal critical damage, we don't have anything to do with this support gem's downside, because accuracy is hard to fit in this build, and if you miss with your static strike, you won't deal damage. You can see it is very bad, so you need this keystone. In mid game, if you don't have a 5 link yet, not the biggest deal. You can drop Rage or Innervate. I don't recommend dropping Increased Duration because it gets annoying to play, having to renew your static strike every 3 seconds or so. But if you have a 5 link, go for this setup. If you have a 6 link, go for the endgame setup with Culling Strike. In mid-game auras, until we get the 90% reservation corruption on a Alpha's Hall, we drop Zealotry and Grace. At this point we don't even have the keystone to make Grace worth it yet, and Zealotry doesn't add that much damage, so we can just make do with Wrath and Determination at this point. For utility, Ancestral Cry, Shield Charge and faster attacks, Flame Dash, Tempest Shield for survivability, as well as Molten Shell on cast when damage taken. In endgame, if you have a Squire, go for this support gem setup. If you can't find an Empower, go for a less duration gem. It still gives good amounts of damage. Unless you have a level 4 Empower, this is the way to go. After you have an Empower level 4, socket it instead of less duration. If you don't have a Squire, you can socket anything you want in your shield as you see fit. We touched on Static Strike before. This is the gem setup in the end game we're gonna use. I put all the gems to level 21 in end game. I mean, it doesn't really matter if they are 20. If you can't afford awakened versions of sport gems that support arc, you can go with normal versions of them. Obviously it's gonna be less damage, but you can work your way towards them. Endgame auras, at this point you will have your 90% reservation corrupt on Alpha's Hall, as well as your cluster gem setup and all your reservation cluster passives, so you can fit all the auras. Same utility, we get Arcane Surge from Flame Dash because gems socketed in Mjölner don't have a mana cost. Just try to keep your Arcane Surge up as much as you can, especially on bosses. Same survivability, same Molten Shell, maybe get a wall Molten Shell at this point. For mid game, get a regular Mjölner. Rolls are obviously important, but not too important at this point. And early on in the league, this is the key item for our build. You need to have it to play the build, obviously. Mid game and until we get Esquire, I recommend Rise of the Phoenix. This will also allow us to put Righteous Fire in the build if you don't care much about life regen. If you're in hardcore, I don't really recommend running Righteous Fire, but if you can fit Breath of Fire as well, Running Righteous Fire with this shield is fine until you get Squire. Orian's Prototype. This build uses minus resistances to boost its damage. Orian's Prototype is another key unique for this build. You can obviously play this build without one, but your damage will be significantly lower. For mid game, try to get high chaos resistance if you have a Glorious Vanity equipped, and I really recommend playing this build, starting to play this build with a Glorious Vanity Jewel equipped. And chaos resistance is very important. Try to get a okay rolled chaos resistance close with other resistances. Try to get some attributes in there as well. For boots, same thing. Try to get good chaos res roll. Other resistances, life and movement speed. Doesn't need to be all tier 1, doesn't need to be mirror tier. Just needs to have those rolls and it needs to be okay. You can give up some movement speed as we have shield charge. For better rolls on other resistances, you can give up some life. Not too much though, especially if you're in hardcore. Resistances are very important in this build for survivability. To play the build, Mjölner takes too much attributes, strength and intelligence, and Ascendancy is a must. If you try to fix your attributes any other way with any other amulet, it's gonna cost you a lot, and an Ascendancy is an easy way to fix it. At this point, allocating charisma is gonna be really expensive, so I recommend allocating Ash, Frost and Storm. It is cheap, it gives damage, it gives chance to shock and increased effect on non-damaging ailments. In mid-game, I recommend at least getting one Venter's Gamble for that minus lightning resistance. The rolls doesn't have to be perfect. Low life, quantity, rarity, at least don't go into minus. If you can't get one at this point, it's okay. Try to fix other deficiencies in the build at that point with another ring, such as this one. This one mostly fixes our resistances and some attributes. In mid game, again, get a resistance heavy belt. The belt is quite easy for chaos resistance because you can spam it with essences that give chaos resistance until you get a good one. These items are not cheap at all. Even at mid game, they are a bit pricey, but this build is pricey, but it's all worth it. In mid game, as I said before, a 3 passive cluster is okay. If you get a 2 passive cluster without breaking your chaos resistance and save a point, go for it. For endgame, same Mjölner, maybe a better rolled one. If you can't get a Squire, even at this point, you can go for the Rise of the Phoenix still. But at this point, this is very end game. And if you can accumulate enough currency, go for the Squire, it is worth it. In end game, you need to have a 90% reservation corruption on your Alpha's Hall and get a lab runner on it and get it enchanted. For endgame gloves, better rolls, nothing changed. Get it enchanted, maybe it's not needed, but it is cool to have. The implicits, you need unnerve for spell damage and evasion rating from equipped helmet and boots for survivability. You can change these implicits any way you see fit, but I recommend getting these two. For endgame, I recommend getting a 2-tone boots that give fire and cold resistances, because fixing resistances in this build is quite hard because it is very unique heavy. The difference between this and the mid-game one is its rolls. It doesn't have to be mirrored here. It just needs to have good rolls. And if you have the veiled craft unlocked, craft a chance to avoid being chilled in there. The movement speed may seem low, but we have shield charge. And get a lab runner on this and get that lightning damage enchantment. It is good damage increase against bosses or endgame Ascendancy. Get a good world Ascendancy, catalyze it and anoint it with charisma in endgame. Try to get 2 good rolled Venters gambles. These are gonna be pricey, but you can give up some rolls and try to achieve better Venters gambles in time. You're mostly interested in resistances. Life is also good. We are not interested in quantity or rarity. If you have the currency for it, go on and catalyze it with resistance modifiers catalyst. For endgame belt, again, we use a resistance heavy belt. Try to catalyze it before crafting it so it is cheaper. I recommend using a vanguard belt for armor and evasion, which is also converted to armor. The leather belt is also okay. A Stygian belt if you wanna go for an abyss jewel, but I recommend going for a vanguard belt. Endgame flasks. We fix our ignite immunity through a flask, unless you can get a good Venters with ignite immunity corruption. Until then, we fix it, at least try to fix it with a flask. Quicksilver, granite with armor, and jade flask with evasion. You can set them up as used when charges reach full and don't have to flask piano ever while mapping. For endgame chaos cluster, go for a 2 passive unless you can't fix your chaos resistance through items. Energized armor, a good rolled melding of the flesh. Try to go for that -4 to all maximum elemental resistances stat, because survivability is key in the game and even 1 maximum resistance is important. If you have the currency for it, go for a Watcher's Eye. If you don't, it's not really important. Yes, it gives great amounts of damage, but this is the last item you have to think about. If you have the currency for it, I recommend either the increased lightning damage wrath affix or lightning penetration wrath affix with a zealotry. Consecrated ground you create causes enemies to take increased damage 1. Endgame glorious vanity. At this point, look through what is listed on the trade site. If you're playing in trade, put them in POB and see what they give in passives. I put a random one in here for the time being. If you can find a lightning damage one, chaos resistance one, try to get it. It will fix some of the problems with itemization. For large cluster, again try to get a 3 passive cluster. If you can't, at least get an 8 passive cluster. We've talked about reservation clusters before. I didn't put any side mods in there, but if you can get attributes with these, it is great. Every bit helps. Again, I didn't include a early game items, early game passive tree with this build, but I did include an extreme item tab. Extreme items, first and hardest to get one is reduced attribute enchantment on your Mjölner. If you can get this, you can drop the Ascendancy and put a good amulet with +2 skill gems, fixing your resistances. You can fix some other attributes with this without the need of Ascendancy. This will give great amounts of damage to the build, but getting the attribute requirement enchant on Mjölner is gonna be really hard. There are some ways to get it. One is somehow getting a item level 1 gavel and trying to temper orbit, but tempering orbs are very expensive and spamming them is not really viable. So if you are in Trade League, look for gavels with reduced attribute requirements, enchantments. People may get them running heists and may decide to list them. With the new item GGG introduced in the game, actually it works just like the old Prophecy item, Trash to Treasure, makes it guaranteed to turn into a unique. It is gonna be very expensive in Trade League because some uniques are very expensive and this item basically guarantees that you get it. But if you care about your build more than your currency, you can get it and use it on that gavel. Now getting Mjölner is not guaranteed, so this is a very expensive endeavor. In extreme item section, we have a Dorian's prototype that is corrupted with increased damage. We also get cannot be ignited, as well as Wrath increased aura effect. Since we get cannot be ignited, and this is the extreme section, go for a bottled faith. This gives so much more damage to the build. It is great. Sadly, we can't use the critical strike FX there, but it is okay. In the extreme section, go for a 3 mode Watcher Sai. This is gonna be really expensive and only for extreme players. In extreme gem setups, go for an Awakened Empower. It's gonna be really expensive to get a corrupt level 5 one. If you have the currency for it, go for it. And that's about it for this build. I really like playing this build. It is one of my favorite builds that I made. Gameplay is awesome, I just love it. Again, the numbers may seem low for a build this pricey, but as I mentioned before, it is constant damage with no downtime, and it feels really great to map the boss. Thank you so much for watching. Again, if you wanna do me a favor, follow my Twitch account. I sometimes stream my gameplay there, some other games. Again, regular stuff. Subscribe, like, whatever you wanna do. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you go for this build. I know it is pricey, but it is a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, exiles.